Humans first inhabited Australia around 65,000 years ago. Their descendants are today's Aboriginal people, or Aborigines. Their culture was rich in nature as their traditions, religious practices, and ways of communication and life are admired and appreciated by many. The Aborigines lived happily in peace until their lives were turned upside down when Britain began to colonise Australia in 1788 for its abundant land and resources. Prior to its encounters with the natives, Britain's main motive for colonising Australia was to compensate for American independence. America was previously Britain's jail, but now Britain needed a new place to send its convicts. The colonisation of Australia was marked by racial inequalities, with the British viewing the Aborigines as inferior and massacring them in order to make space for their personal gain, including prisons. Combined with the onset of European disease, Aboriginal populations suffered in the long run and were forced to adapt to several hardships and adversities. The Tasmanian Aboriginal tribe is an example of the atrocities and violence which many other tribes faced. Before Britain invaded the Tasmanians, they were a well-developed, thriving culture with at least 30,000 years of settlement. However, when the British were done with their exploitation and pillaging, there was only one native Aboriginal family left on the island. Tasmania had joined the many other dead tribes to come. As more Australians recognised these issues, advocacy for the fair treatment of natives increased through the Aboriginal rights movement, thus shrinking the gap of inequality between whites and natives, making it a stepping stone for the full civil rights of minorities. While most people around the world recognise the harshness of British dispossession and violence against the Aboriginal people in the 19th century, the new Australian state, federalised in 1901, further mistreated the Aboriginals. The legal segregation in Australia started a downward spiral which caused many other issues for Aboriginals. The White Australia policy gave white people a feeling of superiority while depriving Aboriginals of essential resources. The government made it easy to prosecute Aboriginals by making unfair laws. Alcohol was illegal for Aborigines due to racist misconceptions that they were binge drinkers and abusers. However, domestic abuse stemmed from the government's policies that oppressed Aborigines. The government imposed severe economic hardship on communities by taking away opportunities for moving up in the world. With meagre employment rates, families were under great stress. Crowded houses caused tensions which quickly turned into fighting, thus creating generational trauma that children would pass on to their children. The government further raised these abuse rates by putting Aboriginal children in horrible situations, such as the stolen generation. The stolen generation refers to the groups of Aboriginal children that were taken away from their families to be forcefully assimilated into white culture. Police often forced entry into Aboriginal homes and schools, stealing children in broad daylight, destroying families. The children frequently never reconnected with their families and were left alone in the world, being beaten and abused by those around them. However, even children that remained with their families were wronged by the government, with a lack of availability and quality of education. Aborigines were taught by the unqualified individuals in their reservations due to segregation. To make it harder to access education, medical documents were soon required to attend schools, which Aboriginals lacking healthcare often didn't have. Even when Aboriginal schools were established, there were very few, as Aboriginal children were not believed to have the ability to keep up with white children anyway. The Aboriginals were done getting walked over. In the 1920s and 30s, three essential groups in the struggle for equality were established: the Aborigines Progressive Association, the Australian Aboriginal League, and the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association. The Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association was established in 1924 by Frank Maynard. In the first 6 months, the group attracted more than 500 members as they strived to give the rights Aboriginals deserved back to them, like owning land, voting, and keeping children and culture. Created in Melbourne in 1933 by William Cooper, the Australian Aboriginal League focused mainly on ridding the law of legal segregation and providing the Aboriginal community with the boost they needed to have equal opportunities again. This was the first solely Aboriginal group to form. The last group to be established was the Aborigines Progressive Association in 1937 by William Ferguson. With Ferguson's father being Scottish and his mother being Aboriginal, he provided the movement with both perspectives. Ferguson strived for the same things as the other groups, but focused significantly more on the children of the stolen generation. Due to this, the last straw for him was when the Aboriginals Protection Board, the part of the government that controlled Aboriginals, increased their rights to take away children and make decisions for all Aboriginals in 1936. Ferguson collected all three of these organisations and led the first Aboriginal protest in 1938, known as the Day of Mourning. It was on the 150th anniversary of colonisation on January the 26th, 1788. Even with the government trying to initiate discussions, the protest went ahead, as a group of protesters convened in Australian Hall in Sydney and announced a request for full rights as citizens. The protest was cemented as the starting point in the efforts for Aboriginal rights. It inspired the Comaragunja strike when 200 Aboriginals walked away from the reservations they were confined to by the government, demanding the same rights as citizens and the removal of the power the APB had over their lives. This would ultimately lead to the APB being broken down and turned into the Aborigines Welfare Board, which would later give Aboriginals the ability to be elected to government. Throughout these periods of protest and struggle, the government fought the Aboriginals the whole way. Though their previous goal was to get rid of the ABP completely, the APA decided it would be more strategic to become a part of it instead. When the Labour Party held government in Australia in the 1940s, they faced pressure to let Aboriginals have representatives. The party eventually gave in to the protesting and allowed two positions to open up, into which William Ferguson and Walter Page, another famous activist at the time, were voted. However, the government was not done trying to prevent Aboriginal representatives. They opposed Page's election due to him being a full-blooded Aboriginal, but later he was confirmed onto the board. However much they tried, Ferguson and Page struggled to get points across in government, and were often ignored. At this point, World War II occurred, and brought with it a dry patch of progression for the Aboriginal community's rights. They had been silenced once more. When the war was over, however, rights groups tried different approaches to make themselves heard. The government ignored them, and the court system was biased, so activists decided to appeal to the public. Activists started public demonstrations in an attempt to highlight the injustices Aboriginals faced. War costs became a popular thing for Aboriginal workers to do when they felt unfairly treated and used by their employers, as they were paid with rations, not wages. One of the most significant war costs occurred at Lake Nash Cattle Station in northern Australia, led by Banjo Morton. By walking away from that unjust environment, the group got their sought-after wage. Though it was not much money, this represented the ability Aboriginals had to stand up for themselves and be treated the way they deserved. Another form of public demonstration were freedom rides. On February the 12th, 1965, a group of Sydney University students set off on a quest. Their goal was to bus around rural Australian areas and record the disgusting injustices Aboriginal people faced every day to broadcast across the whole nation. They recorded whites blocking Aboriginals from public baths and criticised movie theatres that separated seatings and entrances. This was led by an Aboriginal man named Charles Perkins, whose goal was to show the disgraceful actions of white people, and in the words of Perkins himself,
my deeper objective was for Aboriginal people to realise, hey, listen, second class is not good enough, you know? You don't have to always be first class, but don't always be second class.
Awareness of the issues in society in the public eye were raised massively and assisted in starting the referendum of 1967, the biggest leap for civil rights yet. The referendum of 1967 marked the start of an era of acceptance and change for the Aboriginal rights movement. The referendum made it so that Aboriginals would be counted towards the population of Australia, like the whites, and that they would be held to the same laws as well. An overwhelming majority of people supported this change to the Constitution, and Aboriginals viewed this as a gateway to a much brighter future. In the 1970s, 3 new organisations were established in Redfern, an area densely populated by Aboriginals at the time. The Aboriginal Legal Service was made to provide free legal advice for impoverished communities that could not afford lawyers. It assisted in preventing many unjust and biased convictions that would have occurred had a professional not been present. The Aboriginal Medical Service provided basic and necessary healthcare that disadvantaged communities would not have had access to. They functioned using their own money until August of 1971, when they were given a grant by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and have saved thousands of lives to this day. The most impactful out of the 3, the Aboriginal Housing Community, set up houses in Redfern after many Aboriginals were found squatting in the block. The block was an area where many extended Aboriginal families congregated. By putting a roof over these people's heads, the AHC provided them with more opportunities, thus pushing the Aboriginals up the societal ladder. There were still protests for some things at this time, like land rights. This led to the Tent Embassy being formed outside Australian Parliament. The Tent Embassy represents all Aboriginal protests that happened and any to come in the future, providing the community with a space to convene when they want to get their message across to the government. The concept of the Tent Embassy gained support very quickly, thus making the goal for land rights much more obtainable. Just 4 years after the Tent Embassy was established, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act was passed. This allowed Aboriginals to reclaim land stolen from them if they could prove traditional ownership. In comparison to the many years it took to get voting rights, 4 years from the start of a protest showed huge growth in the support of the Aboriginal rights movement. Arguably, the greatest achievement of the movement, however, came in 1990, when the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was created. This was a government body that solely represented natives and their best interests, putting them politically on par with everyone else. In more recent times, reconciliation efforts have been made by the government, such as Sorry Day. Sorry Day was made to apologise for the atrocities the stolen generation faced, and to show support in the many years it will take for them and their ancestors to recover. It is celebrated on May the 26th annually. Ultimately, all of the hard work put into protests and demonstrations had paid off and given Aboriginal people a more comfortable place in society. Prior to the Aboriginal rights movement, Australia was a land of hostility to anyone other than whites. Unlike Native Americans, who had the ability to build on the civil rights movement by African Americans in the 1960s, the Aborigines came from nothing. Aborigines were shunned by colonisers and kept behind walls and reservations they were forced into. Aborigines were meant to disappear, but they fought for their rights as human beings and broke down the frontiers the British had constructed. Despite how big these strides towards equality indeed are, there is still much work for years to come to cement Aborigines and their culture in Australian society and history. Nevertheless, such bravery in the face of a bigoted nation portrays the indomitable human spirit at its peak, and can be nothing less than a frontier in history.